need to advance my slides. So before we get started and hop into creating Ren'Py games together, first of all, can I ask everybody, show of hands, who was able to actually download Ren'Py and get it onto their computer? Okay, so all of you, great. That takes care of that, which is awesome. So I just wanted to cover, I know there's a lot of people who might be interested in the term visual novel and maybe aren't as familiar with interactive fiction in general and visual novels. So I just wanted to talk about some examples before we just dive straight in and start making one, because I like everybody to know what we're actually making. So I already mentioned I'm Jamey, that's me with slightly shorter hair, hooray. So in addition to working here at Tech Valley Game Space, I also have a little game studio called Spoony Bird. We're doing lots of little projects here and there. And in the past, I've worked at other places doing mobile games. I've been a game designer working on games for cell phones. Hey, Michael. Cell phones, tablets, things like that. I've also been an AI programmer. So I kind of started as a programmer, and I've worked as a game designer and done some game writing as well. So Ren'Py has some interesting elements of all those things together. So it's a really fun activity. Currently, the thing that I'm doing that's most relevant with a group of other people here at the game space is this game Ding Dong Ditch. This is a game we've been working on for over a year now, actually, and it's a big collaboration with lots of people locally, and it's kind of an old school point and click adventure game. So you go around this sort of suburban setting, and you have to ding dong ditch all your neighbors, and each house is sort of its own self-contained puzzle where you have to figure out how to get to the door and ring the doorbell, and then how to escape without getting caught. So we've been spending a lot of time using Ren'Py and diving into many different aspects of it, and I now feel that I've become a Ren'Py wizard. So it'd be fun to share some of the knowledge we've accrued with you. So that's right, old school. This was our homage to Saved by the Bell, for anybody who remembers the Saved by the Bell opening with many tacky 90s colors and some Nickelodeon gack up there. Classy. Everything classy, including my presentation in Comic Sans fonts, and nothing but the best for these free lesson nights. So yeah, we're going to learn about visual novels. So I just want to talk really quickly in general about interactive fiction. So the first thing that's going to happen is, before I can do that, we're going to get attacked by a bear. Oh no! So let's go get attacked by a bear. This is a website some of you might know. Some of you might know The Onion. This is an affiliate site called Clickhole, which is written by many of the same folks, and they have these things called Click Ventures, and these are a great example of interactive fiction. It's just in a little web browser here, and sort of similar to choose your own adventure stories. So we're going to play this one together real quick as an example and see if we can survive a bear attack. This will be a sort of local version of Twitch Plays. Click venture here. So, yikes, looks like you've disturbed a sleeping grizzly bear. Better act fast because this guy does not look happy. What do you want to do? Choices: run away, stand very still, not make any sudden movements, look around for a weapon, jump into the river. So, does anybody have any preferences among these? Shout them out. All right, so who votes run away? Show hands, run away. Stand very still? Lots of stand still. All right, I think stand very still just won. Here we go. Okay, looks like standing very still was a good move. Collective wisdom. The bear has calmed down. It's sniffing you now, but it doesn't seem enraged. Continue to stand extremely still or pet the bear. Pet the bear. I'm hearing lots of pet the bear. Gotta go with that. Whoa, seems like he really likes that. We've made a new best friend. Our only option here, which we must click to advance, continue petting the bear. I guess we'll do that. A moment passes between you and the bear, a moment you can't quite explain. It's as if for a brief minute you understand each other. You've connected on some deeper cosmic level. You standing here, him standing there, two voyagers from different species, convening on the grand stage that is Earth. Though you've never met before, it has the feeling of a reunion. Together, here in this moment, you've come home. Our only choice is to close our eyes and contemplate this deep, almost spiritual connection. I'm going to give everybody a moment. Lovely. Your eyes are closed, and you're deep in contemplation of nature's splendor, but suddenly you hear something, a voice calling out to you. It's human. Look out, yells the voice, And just when it sounds as if it's right behind you, we will open our eyes. Oh no! The bear is eating the park ranger. Quick, now's your chance to get away. Should we run away or stay and try to help the park ranger? Who says run away? Show of hands. Kind souls. Stay and help the park ranger, I'm assuming, is unanimous. Either that or we're just all gonna not vote. You would not survive a bear attack. You should have run away when you had the chance. The bear finished eating the ranger and then went after you. Sorry, but you would not survive a bear attack.
What about that deep spiritual?
I know. It's like things took a twist. I guess deep spiritual connections only last so long, you know. It was fleeting.
Oh, there's a physical connection.
So thanks everybody for participating in that. I'm sorry that we all were killed. It's a sad tale. So that's one of many different types of examples. So interactive fiction is something that you've probably encountered at some point in some kind of different format. Just generally anything that's involves stories with multiple paths or outcomes where there's some kind of choice element involved where you can have different outcomes based on choices of the reader or the player. So, has anybody read like Choose Your Own Adventure books? Did anybody else kind of grow up with those? I know I did. You Are a Shark, classic favorites. So, these were, a lot of people, at least from my generation, this was our first exposure and our main point of reference for interactive fiction. These were branching stories and they just did it the old school method where, if you're gonna, based on the choice that you make, you go to a different page. So exactly the same as what we just did by clicking on different choices. It's really just the same exact thing, just slightly modernized. And so many great Choose Your Own Adventure books out there. They tended to be very pulpy in general, and that was cool and all. But one of the nice things about the availability of interactive fiction tools like Ren'Py is there's so many different types of stories being told now, not just kind of these very specifically targeted things for sort of young readers and stuff, which is cool. So, an example of like a more recent interactive fiction game would be Depression Quest. Has anybody played that, out of curiosity? If not, definitely check it out. So this is a game, as the description says there, interactive nonfiction about living with depression. So it's a very interesting game that kind of takes that same style of the sort of click venture type choices and story, but with a very different tone, obviously, than that sort of bear attack, goofy click venture. And kind of uses it to express some really, really personal and interesting things. So the structure itself doesn't dictate tone necessarily. There's lots of different things you can do with this. So just wanted to rattle off a couple other examples of different styles of interactive fiction. So old school text adventures where you have to like type in commands to a parser, things like Zork and what have you. Those are an example of interactive fiction. Hypertext fiction is another popular type at the moment. So has quite a few similarities with what we just played. So a lot of times there'll be games that will run in a web browser and use HTML and just like links basically to go to different web pages. This is an awesome one called Crystal Warrior Kesha, in which you play as Kesha, fighting off haters and such. And there's lots of games that incorporate elements of interactive fiction, whether or not it's the entire kind of focus. So here's Walking Dead from Telltale, and Telltale is a very well-known modern developer who makes sort of interactive fiction. BioWare being another one. Any games that have kind of dialogue choices where you can choose what to say to characters or choose what actions to perform, and that might cause different outcomes, right? So yeah, role-playing games as well. Slightly different look, but kind of the underlying structure is very similar often. So we're going to focus on this particular type. So Ren'Py is especially geared towards a form called visual novels. So this is one that, like I said, I wanted to just spend a little bit of time talking about up front because as a genre, it's a genre that has some popular examples in kind of Western culture. It's definitely a form that's sort of, its best known place where it thrives is in Japan. There's visual novels, there's things like dating simulations, there's whole other subgenres that have some similarities with different focuses. But this is an example that, a lot of people who play video games might know. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney, where you're sort of a combination of a mystery investigation game, and then you play as Phoenix in court, and you have to represent your client and cross-examine witnesses and find the lies that they're telling and all these things. So super fun game, whole series of awesome games, really good writing. So visual novels is what we're going to be doing. So let's talk just a little bit about a couple common elements from those. So as we kind of covered already, focusing on story, dialogue, character interactions, relationships, Ren'Py in general and any tool that's geared towards visual novels often has those kind of menu choices in there. So you can make it all action-based choices like in our Bear Attack game, but a lot of them will just make almost all the choices that the player has dialogue choices of what you're kind of saying to other characters and how they respond to that, how that affects your relationship with them. So that's, if you want to focus on that, then it's a really good format. Those things. We've kind of already covered branching paths, menu-driven choices, right? So I think we kind of get that. A lot of games will have multiple endings. So, you can have a branching story that then kind of funnels back down to a single ending ultimately, or you can have it that the game just ends at different points. So for old school games that were like a bit more punishing in general, a lot of those endings might be you die because you got eaten by a bear, for instance. But you can also have like multiple different endings that are all good or all ambiguous that just have some different results. So that's a lot of times something that appeals to players about visual novels. This is something that and again, these are not qualities that all visual novels have. So don't feel like you have to like check off all these points for your game to qualify as a visual novel. No, not so. It's just that some games focus on these more than others, some visual novels. So this is, a game that's very stat heavy. So a lot of games, visual novels will incorporate some role-playing elements so that you can choose different activities to do. You might choose how to spend your day, and if you want to train in a particular skill, and you could build up that skill. And then perhaps, the amount of skill you have in a certain discipline might affect your choices and feed back in. And, you can really get some even larger amounts of branches and variety from incorporating some kind of simulation of like your player and their knowledge and abilities. Right? Puzzles, lots and lots of visual novels. For anybody who's ever played like a point and click adventure game or like a hidden object game, for example, puzzles are a very key element of those, and adventure games as well. Visual novels can be a really good way to present that. Resource management, kind of similar to character stats, right? You can keep track of things like if you earn money for doing certain actions or, whatever resources might be. So this is a game called 80 Days. You have to race around the world, and there's lots of interesting elements that you encounter along the way. And just to reinforce what I mentioned about, visual novel as a format, not dictating like a particular style of story or narrative, pretty much any genre that you can imagine of non-interactive story is usually represented in visual novels as well. So these are the Nancy Drew games, quite popular visual novels that focus on mystery. So a lot of times, you'll see you have things like inventory over here along with dialogue choices. So you might need to find some clues, and if you have certain clues, then that might open up other dialogue options, things like that. Here's a game called Hatful Boyfriend about dating. You go to an all-pigeon academy, or all-bird academy, at least, and you're the only human there, and it's a dating sim, so if you're lucky you might end up with the hunkiest bird around. As mentioned, dating sims are actually a very common type of visual novel. Some more complex sort of social simulations. There's a great game called Hidden Agenda, where you basically take over as the new ruler of a country that just had a sort of despot, sort of tyrannical leader overthrown, and the country is in a bit of chaos and disarray, and you have to make lots of political decisions to try to guide the country and also manage your personal relationships with your kind of cabinet and your advisors and things. If you annoy too many people, then you won't be able to cooperate and get things done, and you might be overthrown yourself. So totally different focus from dating birds, for example. There's lots of good horror visual novels as well, sci-fi, fantasy, any kind of genre that you can think of, really. Lots of them that have interesting historical elements. It's a game called Last Express. Check it out. the entire game takes place on a train on the last voyage of the Orient Express. Super cool game. And these elements, work their way into all kinds of other games. So if you practice making visual novels, these are skills you can apply to any number of other game genres that, just incorporate some elements of branching dialogue. So like here's a game called Way of the Samurai, and in many ways it's an action game where you're sort of this wandering, samurai in this kind of feudal environment where you can sort of pledge your allegiance to whoever you want to, and then if you want to stick with them or not, you can break away from them at different times. And there's all kinds of different groups that want to employ you, and some might or might not be nefarious, and you can kind of decide for yourself. So it's a really cool mix of action and then interactive story. And last but not least, I just wanted to mention, so we're going to hop into Ren'Py now, but Ren'Py is by no means the only tool that you can use to make interactive fiction. And there's a lot of cool ones, and the nice thing is a lot of the tools for interactive fiction are entirely free. Not even like they have a free version that's limited, like just free. I think the people who make these types of things tend to be very enthusiastic about them, and have made some really awesome things. So not all of these are completely free, but most of them are. Twine is one that's great for hypertext fiction, so that game Crystal Warrior Kesha that I mentioned, or anything that you want to make that runs in a browser. Nice thing about Twine is it's all a visual interface, whereas Ren'Py, as you'll find out soon, Ren'Py you kind of write out as a script. So for some people who just writing everything, all their dialogue and branches just in a text file is, you feel right at home. But other people prefer kind of a visual interface where they can link up their different story sections together with a graphical tool, and Twine is awesome for that. Inform is good for making text parser-based things like Zork, where you can enter your commands and stuff, so a little bit more old school. But there's a huge interactive fiction community that focuses entirely on those sort of parser-based command line text adventures. It's still very much a thriving community. And Inform is kind of the most well-known tool for that. And Inkle Writer is one that was created by the people who made that game 80 Days. And I don't know if it's entirely free, it might or might not be, but that's another one as well that's worth checking out. And I know a lot of people who love it. So, anybody have any general questions before we hop into Ren'Py, or are we eager to just get in there?
Are virtually all illustrated novels?
Visual novels.
Yeah, visual novels is usually.
Are they interactive? In other words, multiple endings?
They don't necessarily have to be interactive. They don't necessarily have to be branching. That'll be entirely up to you when you make it. So you can do it entirely linear visual novel. For whatever reasons, people use a separate term for those often. I don't think it's necessarily the most descriptive term, but people tend to call those kinetic novels if they don't have any kind of branching. I guess just to make the distinction. I don't know why they're more kinetic than a visual novel that branches, but yeah, that's a totally cool and valid thing. If you just want to make something that combines words and images together into a linear presentation, like a storybook or a visual comic, you can totally use Ren'Py for that. It's great for that. So, any other general questions before we go on? Okay, awesome. So let me just refer to. I just wanted to flash up here. So my goal is for this to take, probably an hour and a half, and then once we've gotten through kind of a few of the basics, then I have some bonus stuff, and I want to do like Q&A as well. So we've kind of just covered this, which will be the longest section. So the next thing that we're going to do is actually open up the Ren'Py launcher. So for those of you who have installed Ren'Py, you should have it, wherever you've placed it. If you double click on just the Ren'Py executable icon, it'll open up something like this, where it's launcher. So this is where you can see all of the projects that you're currently working on. You can see I'm a big messy person with lots of different random things going. What you should have is these two here, tutorial and the question. So these are the two built-in example interactive fiction things that come with Ren'Py, and they each serve a great purpose for learning. So the tutorial is actually a very comprehensive reference guide. It's really more of a reference than a tutorial, but it is nicely divided up into different sections, and so it's all written in Ren'Py, and it's sort of an instructional thing that is like a visual novel where you can choose particular topics you might be interested in, and it'll show you an example. It'll show you alongside, you know, an actual example of like a little snippet of script, like what you need to write, and then it will show you on screen beside it what that accomplishes and what the actual effect is in Ren'Py. So that's really cool. We might take a quick look at it, but we're going to start with this other built-in example called the question. So the question is designed to be a super pared down, like almost as simple as possible version of a Ren'Py visual novel. And it basically just covers the most essential things that you'll want to learn first. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at this. If you click it over here to select it, then you'll just need to do launch project down here, and it should bring it up. So we'll take a look. Often takes a second to start up, and then you'll be on this initial screen here. Let's see, just want to make sure that everybody gets there. And so once you're on the title screen, this is kind of just a standard thing for a Ren'Py game. You can change around everything in Ren'Py, which is a very nice aspect of it. Pretty much everything is customizable, but because this is meant to be a simple example, everything here is kind of the default. So this is what you'll get when you create your own project. You'll have all these menu things by default and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and start up the question.
Just looking ahead, does it work for a user, so to speak?
Mm-hmm.
Looking at this.
Yeah.
There's an export, isn't there? Video, I guess. Is that correct?
So there are ways to export it. No, you don't have to have Ren'Py to run the games. So to work on the games, you do need to have Ren'Py installed. But once you get your game done, that's a really good point to mention up front. You can export your game as just a Windows, Mac, Linux executable. So by default, Ren'Py supports Windows, Mac, and Linux. I believe you can export possibly to Android. I don't know if the support is as robust as, you know, its primary targets are, you know, computer. But yeah, and then you can basically distribute that executable. It's just like any other, you know, executable that you would distribute. So it doesn't require anybody to have installed Ren'Py in order to run your game. So your game has a nice wide audience of basically anybody using Windows, Mac, or Linux. Yep, no problem. So here's an example of, you know, most Ren'Py games will consist of a background. The standard size for backgrounds in Ren'Py is an 800 by 600 image. So if you're making backgrounds for your game, you just want to keep that in mind, that you'll want to be creating images that are that size by default. I suggest when you create images and then kind of export them out in order to be able to bring them into Ren'Py, you should try to save your images out as PNGs, because that's kind of just a general image format that Ren'Py knows how to work with, and you won't encounter any problems, and handles things like transparency very well and things like that. So we just have a background here, and then, you know, a line of text where the character is talking. Some Ren'Py games are kind of presented from first person, from the character's perspective. It's up to you. And if you want to advance the text, you just click with the mouse. This is the default. So you click down, get the next line of text. So, you know, the player can basically go through and read at their own pace. Then we have a transition. So right there where it switched from one background to another, that's our first example of a transition. Ren'Py makes all the things that we're seeing here quite simple. You know, these are some of the most common things that are done in a visual novel, and Ren'Py is designed to just simplify those most common tasks as much as possible. So here we have our first character appearing that we're going to interact with sort of a little fading in effect for those of you who noticed. And we click through some more text, and here we have our first choice. So this is Ren'Py's standard way of presenting those same types of choices that we just saw in our click venture. So we don't exactly know what we're asking her based on the description so far, but we can either do it now or later. So I'm going to go ahead and ask her right away. You can see there was an expression change there, so you can basically, a lot of what you're doing in terms of presenting different visuals to the player will just be swapping out static images for other static images. You can do animations, and Ren'Py has lots of cool built-in things to do animations to make things move around and all kinds of other things you might want to do. But by default, the easiest thing to do is just swap out static images. So we're going to take a look at the images that are used for this project in a second and see how they're set up. Another scene transition. So you notice there's things like they have some kind of general narration here. And then they have spoken dialogue with a character's name that's speaking here. So when you're actually saying something out loud, they have this me here. So that, again, that's another thing that Ren'Py gives you an easy way to set up. So we finally know what the question is that we're asking our childhood friend here. Will you be my artist for a visual novel? Uh-oh. Dun dun dun. Shocked. What is a visual novel? So we have yet another choice here. We've kind of covered what visual novels are, so you can kind of choose whatever you think is the most essential aspect. I'm going to go with a story with pictures. See, I probably didn't need to go through that whole explanation because the question kind of explains what they are. And another scene transition. Here we have some text displaying with just a black background. So you can actually transition to not necessarily an image, but you can just tell Ren'Py fill in with a particular color. And that can be nice for doing blackout transitions, things like that. Fades black. Very abrupt. There's no time in this simple example for lots of relationship and character development, but suddenly we're getting married. And sure, why not? So if you work on visual novels with your friend, then your relationship will blossom into true romance. So you may want to pick and choose carefully who you work with on your visual novels. And and here we have that last thing that says good ending. So a lot of times visual novels will often kind of present to players like, hey, there are actually more endings. So they might show something at the end. And again, it's totally up to you if you want to do it. But I've seen a lot of visual novels that say like, this was ending 1 of 42. And if you want to encourage your players to kind of replay your story and check out different branches, that can be a good way to do it. So those are some basics. We can quit out of here just by clicking quit. And so now let's look at the scripts and the images. So if you want to actually edit a project in Ren'Py, then over here it says edit file. You can click on all script files. Now chances are it's going to pop up with something for you asking you to pick your editor. This is something that I probably should have had people do up front, but I already have an editor installed, so it's not going to pop that up for me. But when it comes up with the choice of editor, I suggest choosing the top one, the one that they say is recommended. It's called Editra. If you click that, it should download and install it pretty quick. We'll see how quick it does it with the internet here. But and then once you've done that, you should be able to click on all script files, and it should open up this editor that you've got here. I'm just going to go ahead and, so we talked a bit about the launcher, question, talked about the tutorial. Hopefully get into it. Okay, so I see a lot of people getting into Editra, which is excellent. Does anybody else need me to hold on, or am I good to go? Okay, well, we'll continue on. Okay. So this is our script for the question, the game that we just played. And so you can see everything that we do to kind of lay out how our visual novel is structured, all the text and the images and things like that, we all just write it into this script. And if we look, so the script for this question, you can kind of think about, so for that game that we just played, fairly quick thing, It was a little over 200 lines of script with, lots of spaces in there and other things. So at the very top, there's this section. You'll see there are some lines that start with this little hash symbol, pound symbol, whatever you want to call it. These are comments. So this is something that the actual Ren'Py game will completely ignore. They're only there for you to be able to write like reminders to yourself or little descriptions if you want to remember later why it was that you did something. It can be quite handy for that. Or if you're working with other people and you want to write them some notes just inline in your script, it's good for that. Underneath that, we've got a big section here with a bunch of image statements. So Ren'Py in general, when we write our scripts, we're basically, we're writing out a lot of things just in kind of plain English, all of our dialogue and things like that. But we also can write special commands to Ren'Py. Ren'Py is kind of its own little language that has built-in keywords that when you write these certain statements, Ren'Py will recognize that and say, hey, okay, I know what that means. I'm going to do a particular thing. So image, and you can see if you install Editra, it kind of gives you some color highlighting for those things for keywords. So image is a built-in keyword, and when you type that, then Ren'Py expects that you're going to be ultimately giving it the name of an image file. So you see all of these are PNGs or in a few cases JPEG images. So this is how we define all of our backgrounds, our character images, and basically anything else that we're going to display. We just have an image statement. So after the image statement, you can basically give it a name. And this is a name that you're going to use to refer to that image later on. So later on in your script, if I want to say, it's time to display Sylvie, this character, I want her to appear, then you would refer to it by this name that you've given it. So the first one generally will be the name. One thing for those of you who actually are a little bit more familiar with sort of general programming languages that might throw you off, I know it did for me, was this is kind of thing that you run into a lot in programming, but you usually only have one name for a thing instead of like multiple. And so basically the way that Ren'Py does it is a little different. All of these are just kind of tags. And so it's quite handy when you have a situation like the one we looked at where we had the character of Sylvie change her expression, which is a super common thing. You'll do 4 or 5 different character facial expressions that you can use for lots of different events in the story, and you want to swap between them. So when you want to have one character and basically just replace some small aspect of it, Ren'Py uses the system for this, and basically all of these are like image tags. So it tries to use the most accurate version it can find. So if you tell it to show Sylvie surprised, then that's the way that you can be absolutely sure. So the basic thing is you can kind of think of it while you're still learning as like the full name of the thing is like this entire thing, basically. So Sylvie normal would be the entire name. And you'll see, just as a sneak preview, like down here towards the bottom, there's show Sylvie normal. But there are some cases, as you get into more advanced stuff, where having these multiple names can be quite useful. It is a little bit more confusing. We're probably not going to run into any cases where we really have a need for this functionality. But I just wanted to mention it because it threw me off when I first did it.
Does it pull that tag like off of the name that she reads it and figures that out? Or?
Yeah, so what it does is when you refer to it somewhere later in your script, when you say, I want to show Sylvie normal, it says, okay, I'm going to expect that somewhere there's been an image declared with that name. So it kind of like looks it up. So it jumps from here, goes up, finds where you declared it, and then it says, okay, we said this was equal to, and this is the actual name of a file on your computer. So let's go look at the actual files. If we can for this. I'm going to hope that I can actually find it easily. Let's see. Where is the question here? So in my case, I've got it here. So wherever you've installed Ren'Py, the same place that you double-clicked on the icon to launch, I have mine in a very weird, inconvenient location on my computer. But in here where you've got the executable, you'll see there's also a folder called the question. So we should look at that and see when you create a new project in Ren'Py, which I'll show you how to do in a minute, Ren'Py is going to generate a folder for you by default and put some things in it. So let's go and see what the actual files are in the question. So you've got some kind of general stuff here, like an icon that would show for your game. Inside of this game folder is where the action is. So here we have all of those images that we saw for the character, PNGs. And so we see we've got Sylvie_normal.png here. And that's the name of the image that we're telling Ren'Py to look for here. By default, it will look in this game folder. So when you're first starting out making your games, you're going to want to drop your images into the folder that's been created for you, and then this game folder. If you put them in here and then just refer to them by name, Ren'Py should be able to find them. If you happen to run it and you get an error message, for example, I could try to do this. By the way, you can totally just edit and play around with this. So I'll show you kind of the general flow of making a change here. I'm going to introduce an error, so I can also show you that. But you can just edit this. So I'm going to make this a file name that's mistyped. And I'm saving it. You can do, you can click save or however you prefer. You have to go back to the launcher and then launch your game again. So if you edit the script and then launch, you'll be playing your updated version with your changes. So I'm going to try to launch the question and hopefully I'll get an error pretty quick. Might wait until it actually loads Sylvie in that case. I'm going to mess up the background just to save myself some time. Start in the lecture hall. Let's make that bad. Okay, this is what happens when Ren'Py does not understand you and this does not compute. You basically get a thing that tells you what line of the script it's confused by. And editor by default shows the lines over here, so you can kind of jump right to where you're having a problem, which is nice. And at least, sometimes the errors might be a bit cryptic while you're still learning what things mean. In this case, it's just saying couldn't find this file with this name, and that's because there's no file with that name. So that's the thing you'll probably run into the most often. As far as an error goes, it's just typos with your names and stuff. So you can just quit out and then remedy that nice and quick. And I'll fix Sylvie as well. So yeah, that's the general workflow. When you're editing in here and then relaunching, try things out, come back, make some changes, repeat. So that's declaring images. The next thing that we'll encounter down here is, and thankfully the question has these little comments that try to give you hints about what's going on. So there's a statement called define. There's actually lots of different types of things you can define. This is basically like whenever you want to have some kind of reusable thing that you're going to refer to by a name. Kind of like the images, but you can use it for things that are a little more complicated than just a picture. So in this case, what it's being used for is, if you remember in the question, there were times when it was showing dialogue and it was showing a name above it, like me for the player or Sylvie. This is where you can define names for a particular character. So this first thing here inside of the parentheses, so you have to write character, open parentheses, and you basically give it a comma-separated list of things here. And each thing, there's multiple things you can set. There's actually a lot of other things beyond just the name and the color. And I'm going to show you where the reference guide is in a little bit. But these are the most essential things here that you want to set. So the first thing that you give it is the name, and then you give it a comma, and then this is the color that the name will display as. This comma is a sort of hexadecimal thing. So it's red, green, and blue together as a single number. Most things like Photoshop or image editors like GIMP will, if you pick a color, it will actually show you this number. So you can pick something from just a visual color thing and then just copy this value out and put it in there. So that's how you do that. And the idea is now you've got this name that you used over here, S, as a shorthand for a character. That's quite useful because the vast majority of what you're probably going to be doing with your visual novels is writing some text and writing out what character is saying it. So not having to, even just not having to type out like the full name of a character, normally if you want to show a character speaking a line, you have to write their name on every single line that they speak. So setting up a character with kind of just a very abbreviated name value can be good. So for all Sylvie's lines, we can just prefix them with an S. And for all of the lines spoken by the player character, we could prefix them with an M. And that, just a little time saver, convenience thing. So those are all things that you kind of declare up front and just let Ren'Py know about because you're going to use them later. So now we're going to get into the actual script for our game itself. And so as our comment hopefully tells us, the game starts here. Ren'Py allows you to set up these things called labels. And the start label is a special one. So you're always going to have label start somewhere in your script. And wherever you put that, that is the starting point. So Ren'Py is going to basically hop to this line. And what it does when it runs your game is it just sequentially goes through line by line starting there. So it goes down to the next line, does whatever you said, and just hops through in sequence. And so there's a couple other things we can use labels for that I'll show you in a little bit. I'm going to skip over this. I'll just mention briefly what it is. We're going to go back to it later. Ren'Py is just a little fun fact about it. You don't need to get too concerned about this right now, but Ren'Py is actually built on top of another programming language called Python, which a lot of you might have heard of. Python is just a more general purpose programming scripting language that you can use. And this specialized Ren'Py language with its own keywords is just a convenience thing that's built on top of Python. The nice thing about Ren'Py is you can actually go down to the Python level anytime you want. So you can switch in the middle of your script on just a single line or a particular block of things to be some Python code. And anything that you can do through Ren'Py's special keyword commands, you can also do through Python, plus you can do a whole lot more. So basically, anything that you could do in Python, which is a whole heck of a lot, you can do in a Ren'Py game. So you're not constrained to just doing a visual novel. If you want to have sections that have some other type of gameplay in them to break things up, you could do that. A lot of people use Ren'Py because it's such a just accessible free tool. There's some people who just use it for user interface for a game because a lot of the things that it has built in are great for setting up menus and things like that. And then they just do the rest of the game in Python and you can make anything. If you play the tutorial, then there's parts of the reference that actually show this off, and they'll switch from a conversation into playing Pong and then switch back to a conversation. So I love that about Ren'Py personally. Even if you don't find yourself using it that much to start off with, you have total flexibility to do all kinds of stuff with it. So anyway, the reason I mention that here is because when you have a single line of Python, you prefix it with this $sign. So that $sign is just an indication this is actually Python script instead of Ren'Py. There's another thing you can do, which is set up a whole block of Python. But for now, we're keeping it simple. You can just kind of use that $sign thing before all your Python lines. So we're going to come back to what this is actually doing in a little bit. Next line that we have here in our game, we all generally had our speakers off, but you can actually just play music as well. So the question game has just a little background rockin' soundtrack there. And this is the Ren'Py keyword to do that, is if you say play music, and you just need to give it the name of some kind of audio file, preferably either this type, .ogg or OGG, I can't remember how you're supposed to pronounce it. You can, I believe, give it MP3 or WAV, but obviously you can definitely do this since it works here. That file is also here, same place as all your images. So that's the actual music file for the game. Fairly straightforward. By the way, as I'm going through, by all means, please do ask any questions if you have them. I will not be sad about being interrupted. So now we get to our first example of actually showing an image. So a lot of times the very first thing that you're going to do is actually load up a background. Otherwise your game is just going to be showing, plain black or even just transparent, which is not too nice. So this scene statement here is what you use. Scene statement says basically unload any previous backgrounds that we're showing and show the new one. And it actually takes into account these tags. So this is one extra area where actually you will benefit from tags very early on. So if you see up here where we defined all of our backgrounds, all of them start with BG, the BG tag. One other benefit of tags is that when you tell Ren'Py that you want to show an image that has a certain tag, if there's another image with that tag showing, it will replace it. So, by convention, a lot of people in Ren'Py tag all of their backgrounds with this BG because basically, that prevents you from having to have two separate lines when you're scripting that says, I want to stop drawing the previous background and then I want to start drawing the new background. As long as both your backgrounds have this same tag, then when you say scene, you just give it the new one that you want to show. And it knows, okay, any images that are already showing with the BG tag, stop drawing those before I start drawing this new one. And so that's why it's quite good for characters as well. If you have Sylvie and one of Sylvie's expressions is showing, you can just say, I want to show Sylvie smiling now, and it will get rid of any previous version of Sylvie. So you want to have overlapping images of Sylvie with different poses drawing on top of each other, which could be quite disturbing. So that's scene, the scene statement. And again, this name, lecture hall, is just the thing that was defined up here, BG lecture hall. Then we have the with statement. So any kind of image that you're going to show in Ren'Py, you can take advantage of lots of built-in visual transitions. And so this with statement then expects that you're going to give it some name of a visual transition. You can define your own. It's quite a similar method to the way we defined a character. But Ren'Py supplies all kinds of common ones for you. So this fade is actually a built-in, predefined one. So when we started up our game and it kind of faded into the lecture hall background, that is because we added this with fade thing. If you don't have that, this is an optional thing that you add after the line where you're displaying. It will then apply that to when it actually shows this. If you don't have that, then it would just pop in, basically. And a lot of times it's nice to have some kind of little transition to make it nicer. So now we get into our text. And again, because this is such a common core aspect of making a visual novel, Ren'Py makes it as simple as possible. So every line of text that you want to display, you basically put on its own line, and each line break, basically, it assumes that the player has to click to then advance to the next line. So you can put a bunch of text in here, but you often just want to break it up into kind of readable chunks, and then as long as it's on its own line, Ren'Py automatically knows player needs to interact in order to advance. If you don't have any name of a character ahead of it, then it would just be showing text, in the way that the question did when it was just the white text in the box, no character. So yeah, we have our little prologue text here. We then see another scene statement. And so again, just reinforcing, as I was mentioning before, you don't actually have to say stop drawing lecture hall because you're just saying scene, and then it says, okay, BG, and we're going to unload this previous one before we show this. And this with fade, similar to before. There's lists of the different transitions and things. So I'll go ahead and show you the reference really quickly, where you can look these things up. Because when you're just looking at kind of a new project, it's okay, I know that there are some built-in transitions, but what are they, right? So let's go ahead and check that out. If you go back to where you downloaded Ren'Py, ren'py.org, some of you might have checked this out already, but there's this documentation link. If you click that, there's a nice little getting started guide that, again, if there's anything that I end up covering that, you want to revisit to reinforce, a lot of the same topics here are in this little quick start. You can get really far with just the stuff that's covered here. You could really do a whole visual novel with just these basics. But there's also references for things like transitions. So somewhere within this documentation, there'll be an actual list of them. I don't know if it's actually there or not, but it's somewhere in here. Yeah, so here's an example, right? Predefined transitions. And we've got fade, dissolve, pixelate, move, all kinds of different things. The tutorial actually gives a very nice overview of some of these as well, where it just talks about each one and also shows you what it does together. So tutorials may be an even better way to get a gentle introduction to that. So more of the same, more of what we've seen before, and now we reach our first actual branching choice where the player has to make a decision. So that's accomplished with this built-in menu keyword. So there's one tricky thing about Ren'Py. As I mentioned, probably the most common error type that you'll encounter is like typos of your image names when you're first starting. The other most common type of error that people run into, myself included when I was starting, is Ren'Py is actually quite finicky about the tabs that you use in your script. So when you tab or indent things, that actually has significance to Ren'Py. So it's something that takes a little getting used to. It's something that it inherits from Python. Python has the same sort of method of attaching significance to indentation. So what you'll generally see in Ren'Py is that there'll be certain commands that Ren'Py will only accept them if you have a little colon at the end. So a label is our first example that we saw up here. And generally, anytime that you see a command like that, the idea is there's going to be some block of stuff that's sort of like inside of that. It's like wrapped up within that. And that block of stuff, by convention and in fact just by the syntax of the language, you need to indent it. So if you do not indent it, you will make Ren'Py sad and it will yell at you. So
just some white space or certainly.
So specifically, like one tab in is what you want to do. And like, for example, if I was to bring this line up here and then press enter and just tab in, like it will give you that. One thing that I suggest within this editor that I found to be helpful, because this takes some getting used to, especially for people who haven't done any programming in Python, you can actually turn on a little display of like vertical lines that show what things are aligned as far as indentation goes. I find that really helpful. I don't know if I exactly remember how to do it. Indentation guides. So yeah, I think it's this. If you click on view at the top, go to editor, and then indentation guides, it gives you these kind of hint things. So basically anything that is sort of grouped together in a section, you want it to be indented to the same degree. So here we have our menu. When we use this keyword to tell Ren'Py, okay, I'm going into a section now where there's going to be however many number of options, then Ren'Py sets it up so that, okay, I want to have all of those options contained inside of this menu. So again, conceptually, like each one of these is grouped together in this menu. So that's why there's a colon, and then each choice is indented inside of this. And the way that you provide the actual choices is just by having each of the choices inside of quotes here. So just like you're writing a regular line of text, this is the text that will actually be displayed on the button that the player can click. And then for each one of those, there's going to be some different reaction that happens in the game when the player actually chooses that, right? So that's why the line itself is also something that can contain a block of stuff. So anything that has this colon, there's like generally a variable length, set of things that is contained within it. So in our case here, each of our choices just does one thing, but there's all kinds of different things we could do, right? We could actually like display a different scene. We could go back to the lecture hall. We could have some other response dialogue. Why did you ask me so quickly, right? So it's totally up to you. And the key thing is anything that's happening in response to this choice needs to be indented underneath this line, basically. So it's just this block of stuff that it's going to do in that case. Yeah. Do you have a question? Or are you stretching?
So we need a colon after that.
Yeah. This one you mean, or?
Yeah.
Yeah, you do need a colon there for this syntax because this is just telling Ren'Py I'm going to have some other stuff that's going to happen in response. And that's pretty much always the case in a visual novel when the player clicks on one of these choices. Like something's going to happen in response, and that something is going to be written here underneath the choice and indented. Does that make sense? Maybe. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I'll try to kind of revisit that, and we can maybe when we get to questions like at the end and stuff, I can try to cover it a different way. Yes, that's exactly right. So if you're familiar with the programming concept of brackets, right? Most programming languages, if not all, have this concept of like a block of instructions that happen. And this is just Python's way of doing it, which then Ren'Py happens to inherit from Python. So like a lot of times in a programming language, just for those who this will help, there would be an equivalent thing like this, or for those who prefer, programmers get very picky about these things. But that's just the way of denoting, like there's a block of stuff and it's all associated with this start label. So it's going to do, you know, first thing, second thing, and so on. And the most common way to do it is to indent it anyway, but most programming languages don't enforce that. Python just happens to enforce it. So instead of using curly brackets as a block of stuff, it just uses a colon at the start. So it just replaces that. And then there's no bracket at the end. It just says, once it's not indented anymore, we're not in that block anymore.
A lot more like the way we would write in a word processor.
Yeah, I mean, I think for people who haven't necessarily come from another programming language, it can almost be maybe a little more intuitive. It took me a long time to get used to, because this is by far the more common way to do it in most programming languages. It's actually one of the main stumbling blocks for anybody learning Python initially, coming from another programming environment. But it starts to become more second nature as you go along. So don't worry if it doesn't totally make perfect sense right now. It's something that through practice I think will start to become a lot more obvious how it works. So in this case now, we've got these two menu choices. And all that we're doing here in either case is doing this jump label. So this is kind of the most straightforward way of doing a branching path in your story. Remember we had this label start here, and I mentioned you can actually have other labels. So if we scroll down, we see we've got this other section of stuff underneath this label called right away. And then we've got somewhere another label for later. By the way, if you ever want to search your scripts, you can do Control F, or I think it's like Edit Find or something like that, Tools Find. You can search for a particular term. So like this jump later, I want to find if there's any other use of the word later. And in fact, if I search for it, why yes, there it is. So we have this other label defined down here. So the way that it works is when you have this jump statement, you give it the name, and this is the name of a label somewhere else in your script. So this is how you can kind of organize your different branching paths. If this goes to some other section of the story, when you make this choice, it's going to go to the section that's labeled right away, which happens to be right down here. If you choose to ask for later, it's going to jump to the section of your script that responds to that. So that's that other label that we looked at that was set up down here. Yeah, they happen to put it at the bottom because it's basically game over at that point. That's when you get eaten by the bear. So jumps and labels is just the way that you do branching within Ren'Py. So you can have totally different set of actions happen at either one of those labels. And it'll only be going to one or the other, right, based on whichever choice was made. Because then if you choose this choice, it's going to go down into this block of script and okay, I said to jump. So as soon as it reads this line, jump right away, it looks for that label with the same name. And instead of like going on in sequence, it actually like warps there, jumps the execution of your script basically, and starts moving at that point. So when we jump later, we're not going to go down and then start doing this stuff. We're going to hop down to our later label and just start doing this stuff instead.
Like go to.
What's that?
Like go to.
Yes. Very much like go-to. I know that will send shivers down the spine of certain programmers, but yeah. So let's keeping on here and see if there's any other new stuff. Right there, we've covered like a lot of the basics of, you could do an entire visual novel without even, as we mentioned, without even using a menu or any branching choices. You could do it just with text and images, right? But once you get used to this, setting things up in this syntax, it's pretty simple to add all kinds of different variations and different paths through your story. So here we had just the example of having a character's name displayed along with their dialogue. And again, as a reminder, the character was defined up here. So that S for Sylvie, and then you can just prefix that. Same deal here, scene statement, transitions, nothing that we haven't talked about. And here's an example of something that we haven't quite looked at yet. So Ren'Py expects that when you give it a line of dialogue for your visual novel, that line of dialogue will be inside quotes. But sometimes you want to display quotes as well. So again, programmers will be very familiar with these kinds of problems where you actually have to use what's called an escape sequence, but it's kind of just a special set of characters together that you're saying, I don't actually want to end this block of quote, I want to show a quote. So you prefix any quotes that you're displaying with the slash here, and it should be good to go. The backslash, why yes. So let's keep going, see if there's anything new. We've really covered most of what the question uses. Everything that we saw. Here's one thing that's a little different. There's a couple built-in like color things as well. So remember where we had that text where it wasn't showing a background? You don't actually need to like make an image with like just a flat color background. You could just do scene black, and Ren'Py knows that you want to transition to just a black screen. And again, there's somewhere in the documentation where you can find a list of all the built-in colors, or you can define your own as well.
Will it then vary the text to light, dark, any distinctions?
It doesn't automatically vary things like the color of the text, but you have full customizable control basically over that. So you could have like different characters that all their text is defined as a different color, or you can just change it on the fly. So we can hopefully talk about a way to do that. I haven't actually done that recently, or maybe at all for Ding Dong Ditch, but I do know there is a way to do it. So I think the last thing in here that we haven't covered, well, let's see. So there's return. Yeah.
By default, is there like black text area on the screen?
Yeah, so you can style things like the text box, but the default is that one that we saw where it kind of has I think kind of semi-transparent black rectangle. Yeah, so this is the default way that it looks, and it will show that no matter what. So if it's a black background, it will still show it as a semi-transparent black thing, and you won't really see that, right? You'll just see the white text. So that's another thing that you can customize, just like pretty much anything within here. So yeah, I think there's actually just two last things to talk about with this example, which is at a certain point, often at the end of a block of stuff within a certain label, you might see this return. In our case, you can probably get a hint of what that means by the fact that in both cases it follows the ending. Return is just basically saying, we're done, don't continue on beyond this point, right? So most often you'll just have it at the end of one of your branches to let Ren'Py know that's the end of that path, effectively. And
Well, does it take it back to some previous point of execution, or
nope.
it ends?
There are some other locations where you can use it, and contextually it can bring you back to a location, but in this most common form where it's just in the middle of some script inside a label, it just ends. It ends the game at that point. It goes back to the menu. So yeah, that's what it's most commonly used for, at least when people are starting out. And so now that we've covered those basics, I want to revisit this thing. So some of you might have made different choices than I did when you were playing through the example. And so, we had this thing where there was this initial choice of whether to ask your friend a question right away or ask her later. And that, in this case, there's a total story branch where asking her later gives you some more text and then you get the bad ending. So that's like a very large distinction. But sometimes when the player makes choices, you don't want to do something as dramatic as like a total story branch, but you might want to do things like just keep track of the fact and remember that the player made that choice so that later you can make some maybe subtle changes or big changes based on that. So that's what this one kind of line of Python is doing. So within Python, and basically any other programming language, there's something called a variable. Show of hands, who has heard that term or is familiar with variables and what they're used for already? Pretty much everybody. Okay, cool. So within Python, there's no variable types that you declare when you make the variable. So this is actually a variable declaration here. And the type of the variable is determined by the type of the value that you assign. So this is just setting up a Boolean variable where the only two possible values can be true or false. So when you want to keep track of just, something that was like a yes or no answer or, on or off, or did the player do this or not do this, and there's no kind of in between, then a Boolean is a really good way to do that. So in this case, they set up this variable at the very start and they assign it a value of false. They call it BL game. This is the thing that keeps track of whether or not you describe visual novels as hentai games. So that just creates one slight change in the dialogue. It doesn't branch the story, but there's a little throwaway line at the end, like a little gag based on that. So here it's just set up with its initial value of false. And we'll go on to where the actual choice is made that then affects that. So this is the other choice that you make here, where they actually jump to two separate labels, story with pictures or a hentai game, but those labels actually lead back together into the same point at the end. So based on what you say, there's some different dialogue. And in the case where you say it's a hentai game, it jumps down to this label, and you see there's another line of script here, another line of Python script where it actually updates the value that's stored in that variable and sets it to true. So it just uses that to keep track of, did you actually bring up hentai or did you leave well enough alone and not bring up hentai? So either way, it actually jumps at the end. You'll see for both of these choices, it jumps to Mary no matter what. So it actually refolds the branching paths back into one thing where you're going to start getting the same results. However, it now either has this value as true or false, and you can check that value and either display text or not display text based on if it's true or not. So within this label, there's this if statement. So it says if that variable, so this is just basically saying if that variable is set to true, then we'll have a little throwaway line about the fact that you had this discussion. And then if it's not true, if it hasn't ever been updated, it's still at that default false value, it will just skip this altogether. So an if statement is another way that you can do introduce some variance into your story. And anything that's inside of this block, you can see again, it basically introduces a new block, and you can have any number of things. We could have a long conversation about the fact that we brought up this topic. Or not, as long or short as you like. So that is kind of the most common use of Python, I would say, is just for a little bit of extra flavor. You can just use Boolean variables and setting them to true or false and checking them to do all kinds of things that will make your game feel more reactive to what the player does, and set it up so that characters remember things that were previously brought up and what have you. So yeah.
Could you read input? I mean, could you have a person type what they think the hentai game is?
Yes, absolutely. You can, if you want to have the player able to type something in, more like the parser-based text adventure games, you can totally do that. If you want to have the player, for example, enter their character's name, be a very common use of that, you can do that. So I am going to jump to, I have a couple other examples that I've made of kind of a couple other things that I thought would be good to talk about. And I tried to make them sort of the most concise version of showing off a certain feature that you might or might not be interested in adding. So let me just go back real quick. Does anybody have any other general questions based on the stuff we just covered with the question?
Just What would be the verb
to take in player input. Cool. So that's actually, I bring that up because that's one of the examples I have is input entry. So we'll go to that. We can go to that next. So cool. So we covered characters and dialogue. We covered some things about graphics. We can talk about things like positioning. You can have things like multiple characters on screen at a time if you want like two different characters talking to each other. So we'll go into that. The tutorial has some really good examples of how you can do that. We kind of covered audio, at least as far as how you can play sounds and music, branching narrative, and Python. So those were the main basics I wanted to cover. Cool. So this is like bonus stuff that I can cover if people are interested. So yeah, I was kind of hoping that we'd just hop to the example projects first of all and start taking a look at that. So let's do that. Let's see. I'm going to close out of here. Don't need to save. So let's see. One of these, I have too many examples at the moment. Let's see. I think it's this practice. I have a couple just odds and ends in here. So if I choose this, oh, by the way, while we're here, I'll just mention if you want to create a new project now, which will probably be one of the first things you'll do after this, it's as simple as clicking on this create new project. It'll ask you to kind of name your project, and then it will generate a folder with the kind of default stuff in it, basically like this without the images. And then you can go there and start tossing in your images. It'll create for you the main script. You can actually split things up into multiple script files. If you jump to a label, it'll actually look at all your script files, so you can have that label in a totally different file and it'll find it. Sometimes if you start to make a really long visual novel, it's good to break it up. But by default, this script.rpy is where it starts looking for that start label. So you can basically create a new project and then click on it in here and then click your script.rpy to edit it. And you'll be good to go. You'll be starting. Okay, so let's launch practice. We'll just take a look real quick because there's no real cohesion here. So here's a name entry. What is your name? You can provide a default or not. My name is Jamey. And it's not going to really do anything with this in this example, but you can have other characters then use that name. And then we have a bird. So I was trying out a couple of things. So this is an example of, in Ren'Py you can have animations and switch between different images. There's all kinds of cool things you can do once you want to start getting a little fancier. So let's look at the actual script for that. I haven't looked at it in probably over a year since I created this. So let me see if I can find the part that's actually relevant. So we'll see, so there's some new things here that we haven't actually seen before. Like this is, these are ways that I'm setting up animations. You can see it's really not that much more involved than setting up an animation. It's not a whole lot of script that you need to write once you figure out what to do. So it's basically just this. So remember I mentioned you can have a whole block of Python code rather than just, it can get annoying if you have a long section of Python to put that $ in front of everything. So Ren'Py has this built-in Python keyword and it expects a block of stuff after it. So these are all lines of Python where it assumes that the $ is in front of it instead of me having to type it. And so when you want to get player input, you actually that's something that you do through Python. And you would do this command, this ren'py.input, and then you just give it two things. So kind of like where we defined a character thing, and then inside of quotes we needed to give it some extra information, like the name of the character and the color. In this case, it needs the extra information of the prompt that we're going to show to the player, and this is an optional thing of whatever the default is that's in there. So if you didn't provide that, it would just have the text prompt. So you could just, I guess the shortest version that you could have is just that, basically. And then this is a variable, just like we declared that Boolean variable. And it's going to, when it reaches this line of Python, it's going to prompt the player to enter something, and then once the player has typed something in and pressed enter, it will store the result in that variable. So this variable now stores the name as the string of text, and you can actually refer to that later. So for whatever reason, in my game it doesn't seem to be actually showing this. I don't know why it hops right to the bird. But clearly, at some point, I had it actually displaying. If you want to actually display some text that's stored in a variable, then you can do it this way. Inside of your text string, you actually use square brackets, which is like a special thing, kind of like that backslash. And then you put the name of the variable. So player name is what's storing whatever the player entered. So if we want to say, hello, player name, then we just need to put the name of that variable in square brackets. And it will replace this with the actual text that's been stored. So, you can get a lot more dynamic conversational stuff in there using variables. That's quite cool. So that's that example. Any questions about that before I show something else? Okay. So I'll show you quickly Ding Dong Ditch. This is probably an old build at this point. I'm not exactly sure which version this is. So although Ren'Py is, by design kind of tailored towards visual novels and the features that we saw in the question, there's all kinds of different things that you can do with it. And so we happen to be making a point-and-click adventure game, more in the style of, like the Nancy Drew sort of first-person games. So you can do things like replace the cursor with another image. We haven't gotten too fancy with our menu yet. We're still kind of using the defaults. Okay, so this is a particular section that I'm working on right now where we made a first-person maze. So you can do things like have regions of the screen that change the cursor and that the player can click on. You can have like interactive props in a scene that when the player mouses over them, the player can like click to interact and then it will show some text. So it can be quite good tool for making point-and-click adventure games, I think. And we are trying to do all kinds of wacky things in Ren'Py. So this is our little fake 3D maze. This is all placeholder art right now. And this is all done just using static images. And so we're basically just drawing multiple images on top of each other and scaling them. You can kind of see where the seam is right now. So those are actually separate images. Clearly I was having some problems where I was trying to display some extra information for myself. But we got this working recently, which was fun. It was quite fun to set this up, like those old dungeon crawlers, So that's just one example. And we're trying to kind of get as many different sort of styles of gameplay as we can, and trying to just like push Ren'Py in fun ways. So here's like our initial script file. You can see we've split things up into lots of different scenes. We basically have a separate script for every house that you can go to on your street. And we have multiple people doing like writing and scripting for it, because a lot of folks have found this to be quite accessible. So that's been a great thing. It's been a great environment for like making collaborative stories and stuff. So anyway, I'm just going to go. Here's my start label, or our start label for Ding Dong Ditch. I happen to be jumping to a particular scene. So that's a way you can do like a level skip, basically, is just jump to a label you want to go to. If I take that out, I can show you kind of just the beginning section. Actually, I'll tell you what. I'm going to jump to the main area here. So this is our kind of hub world, which is like your street that you're on. You see, you can have an image that's bigger than the screen, and you can set up scrolling images. So this is quite fun for this like little hub world. So we just have all these different houses, and then each one is like a little clickable prop where you can kind of choose which one you want to go to, and so on. So a lot of the stuff we're using, would be just like basic Ren'Py functionality. So if we click here, we're just using some kind of standard conversational stuff. Menu choices that we've already learned about. You can have user interface things on the screen, stuff like that. Trying to think of anything else that has like fancy stuff. Here is the bird is back again, flying around. You can set up paths for things to follow while they're animating and have things like go from one location on screen to another. Lots of fun-filled things you can do. So anyway, let's look at a couple more concise examples of particular things. So the one thing that we found the most useful, I don't know, does anybody think they might be interested in maybe doing like a point-and-click adventure at some point, or that style of game? If not, then like I probably won't dwell on this, but I'll show you just a quick. Oops. Oh, okay, awesome. So yeah, we'll look at a quick example here. So here's something I've set up. example project to show. So all the clickable props that I was just showing in Ding Dong Ditch use something called image buttons. So instead of just having an image, it kind of uses that to like wrap up something that's clickable. So image buttons can be used to let the player click on objects in the game. And if you use variables, like we were doing before, you can kind of keep track of, say, things like an inventory of what objects the player has collected and stuff like that. So in this case, you can click on the key or the door. And if you click on the door, it's locked, right? Go click on the key, collected the key. We can stop drawing things when we don't want them to appear anymore. And I'm just using a variable, just a Boolean variable, like the example we just looked at, to say if you have the key or not. So when you click the door, it checks to see if you have it. And if you do, then you use the key to open the door. So, you know, not too shabby, nice and simple. If we look at script for this, we'll just see if there's anything that's kind of worth discussing here. I'm just declaring a couple variables here in a block of Python. This init just says do this first. So that's the only difference there. It'll do these things up front before it does anything else. Set up a background for my wall, same as we did anywhere else. So this is the different thing, which is a screen. So I'm going to kind of just skip that, and then I'll go back to how that's used. So we started our start label here. We go down. Most everything is exactly the same as the stuff we've already learned. But there's this other command that we're using called show screen. So this actually does jump to a different location, kind of like the jump command. So when we choose this, it expects that somewhere there's a screen that's been defined that has the name interactive objects. So it encounters this, and then it hops up here. Ren'Py has a few areas where it almost has like another little mini language for particular tasks, where it tries to give you the most concise set of commands that it can possibly provide in order to accomplish something. So like there's a little section where you can define animations, and there's different keywords that you can only use if you're inside an animation block. And screen is another example. So screen is primarily meant to be used for like menus, actual screens that pop up over things, but there doesn't have to be an actual like background to the screen. So the way that we do things in Ding Dong Ditch is we just have a screen with no background that's just transparent, and we stick buttons on top of it for anything that we want to be clickable. So all the things that you can mouse over and click on are inside of screens, and they are image buttons. So image buttons, were, I guess, ideally intended to be used for things like an OK button on a menu screen or a cancel button or whatever. But you can put any kind of image on it, and they're really customizable. So when you're inside a screen, if you want to have a non-interactive image displayed, you use this add statement, and you give it the name of an image, and you just have to tell it where on screen, so the horizontal and vertical position. But if you want to be interactive, instead of doing add, you use image button. And you just need to give it a little bit of extra info. So one thing that it wants is, it expects for a button that you'll have two pictures. One for when you mouse over it, so that there's a little visual change, and one for when the mouse isn't over it. That's just a good thing. You can actually get around it, but it's kind of a good practice for this type of game to have some indication to the player of what they can click on and what they can't, because that's usually the main source of confusion for players. It's what is actually interactive and what isn't. And you can basically get away with just this part. So you can really just do image button, name, and position, not that different from add. There's lots of other things you can do with image buttons, and you can get real fancy with them. But these are just extra things that I happen to be doing.
Did you show that mouse over on
for the door and the key?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was when it kind of had that green highlight.
Did you show us the actual scripting for that right there?
Oh, for how to like set it up, you mean?
Yeah, that door.
Yeah. So
Am I not seeing it, or it's not there?
So this is the actual script part, but let me go to the image, and I'll talk about how the images are set up, and then go back, and I think that'll help to clarify a little bit. So bear with me here, because I need to go to a separate location.
How do we throw off your presentation?
No, that's totally cool. Let's see. This is not actually what I want. Let's go back. Pardon me. Nope, I was right. Okay. So I have a couple other examples just crammed into this location right here. So this is the actual folder that was generated when I did a new project for that image button example we were looking at. And if I go into the game folder, you've got things like your brick background and things like that. So I've got these two images, door_hover and door_idle. And if we look at them, the hover just has the built-in like highlight around it, and the idle doesn't. So I just drew that highlight on, right? And then Ren'Py, it actually expects things to be in this format. It's kind of a standard format. So anything that you have that's an image button, you'll have an _hover and an _idle. And then if you go back to the script, when you declare an image button, there's this thing auto. And what you do is you write the name, and then you do this little special character here, this %s, and it will look for two separate images. So it's like meant to be a convenience, although it's more of a confusing thing when you're first learning it, that it's going to look for two separate images, one that it replaces this %s with idle, and the other one that it replaces it with hover. And then it knows that it uses the one that's named idle for when the mouse isn't over it, and the one that ends in hover for when the mouse is over it. So yeah, it's really, there's a lot of things in here that are quite condensed. Like once you figure out how to use them, like you can just, go wild, basically.
And your X and Y, you just have to guess that, or is there a tool?
Setting up some looping animations or non-looping is pretty darn simple, I would say.
That caused the bird to flap wings not to move, am I correct?
That's correct. So you can also set up movement independently, and that is done with something called a transform. So anything that has to do with translation, meaning like moving the position of something, or scaling, changing transparency if you want something to fade out, if you've got like a character that's becoming a ghost or something. All those types of things, rotating, those are all called, fall under the heading of transforms. So in my case, I've got this thing in that example, practice example, move from left to right transform. So this is the part that's actually making the bird move. And as with other sections of Ren'Py, like the screen block, there's some special keywords and commands you can only use inside of a transform. So align is actually just setting up its initial position. So this is like its X and Y here. So I have it drawing at the 0 position in the Y, which is the top of the screen, and then I think it starts on the right, maybe, is 1.0. So that's what that is setting it up in the top right corner. And then this line here, linear, is saying over the course of 3 seconds, which is what this 3 is, we're going to change this value, whatever it is. And you can give it a bunch of values that change over that time. But if we change X to line, that moves its position. So it'll say over the course of 3 seconds, change its X position from 1.0, also known as 800 pixels, over to 0 pixels. And if I decide that's not quick enough, I could change it to do that over the course of 1 second. And linear just says do it at a linear speed. That's why it's called linear. You can have lots of other things, like you can have it ease in or ease out, and there's lots of predefined types of motion. If you want the bird to look a little more natural, like it's like swooping or something. I didn't happen to do that in mine. But yeah, that's all it does, is it sets up its initial position, move it from the right to the left over the course of 3 seconds, then move it back to the right over the course of 2 seconds, and then just repeat it over and over again. And so to actually apply that, we'll go to where we actually show the bird, if we can. Wow, I had lots of weird stuff in here. I apologize, this is not the cleanest. So if we search for my flying bird, we'll be able to find where it gets used. That's why this search comes in quite handy sometimes. So here's where I'm displaying it at the start. So right after the player presses something, Apparently there's other stuff that happens after. All the stuff that I was wondering why it didn't show happens after you click, I guess. That's what this pause does, by the way. If you want to just have a click with no like text, if you put a pause in there, it'll wait here until the player clicks. So we only got this far in the example. So anyway, here's where I'm showing the flying bird. So just by virtue of the way I've defined the image, it will automatically be animating just when I say to show it. I don't have to do anything else. But to actually get it to move, it's the second part, which is at. So this at, there's lots of different things you can do with it. And if you go in the tutorial and look at the position, which is one of the first things they show you is how to position things, you'll see there's lots of other things you can do. So it can take the name of a transform, which is what this was, but you can also say just like at right, at left. It has kind of built-in positions where it will say, okay, I want to show the bird, and it kind of knows what you mean by that. You can do things like top left or top center. And again, the reference documentation will tell you all the built-in ones. Or you can define your own. You can define your own positions and transforms. So here we're saying at, this move from left to right is the name of my transform here. And so it's saying show it, animate it, because it's an animated image by definition, and apply this transformation to it. And the transformation is responsible for moving it back and forth. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions about how that works? Okay. I'm curious what the rest of this example has. No. So does anybody have any other questions? We could check on our build here, I suppose, and see what we ended up with. So by default, when it finishes building your distribution, it brings you to where it actually created it. So here's our zip that has our executable in it that we could distribute wherever we want. Go ahead and extract it here. Cool. And so in here, you just have regular old executable that anybody could run. So even if I didn't have Ren'Py installed on here, it'd be all good. And it's the exact same thing you get when you launch your project from the Ren'Py launcher. Just no Ren'Py required. That's that. Any other questions? So we kind of talked about transforms there and also animation a little bit. Kind of sort of screen position, I guess. Did you have another question?
Can you find shortcut keys? Like you have a scene and there's something really going on and you just have a key that transitions you? Or transitions to
you mean like when the player's playing the game, they press the key to transition, or?
Yeah. Like you just have a blank scene and it doesn't do anything when you press any poses.
Yeah, again, it's another one that I haven't actually done. We do everything in Ding Dong Ditch based on clicking, but I would be incredibly surprised if you couldn't set it up so that it advances based on something else. One thing I will, let me show you this because this is something that you'll start to run into very quickly, is so by default, when you create a new project, you always get that script.rpy, which is your main starting point. You also get this options.rpy, and there's all kinds of things you can do in here, even just without having to dive into like the level of writing Python, right, which can be a little bit daunting. You can actually just change around some of these values, and there's all kinds of things you can change. So for instance, you can change the title screen. That's probably the most common thing that people end up wanting to do. Let me see if I can remember what the actual thing is for it. So some of the names aren't necessarily the most helpful, but there are at least some helpful descriptive comments within here. So these are all generated by default. I didn't create these, but in this case, this mm_root is the background that shows on the main menu screen. So if you make an image that you want to show in your main menu, by default you just get like a color. So this is just a color code, but you could replace this with the name of whatever it is, my menu image .png, and as long as that's in there with all your other images, it'll find it, it'll show it. But there's all kinds of other things that you can do, and again in the documentation, I would be willing to wager there's probably something just in here where you can say define your own key that would advance, that would be equivalent to clicking. I don't know for certain or something like that, but that's usually my starting point. If I want to reconfigure things, and a lot of the stuff we do in Ding Dong Ditch that seems like extra fancy is not necessarily accomplished with Python. A lot of it is accomplished just by tweaking these settings, because there's a lot of them. You can get a lot done. Even things like the way that we changed our cursor to be a different image, and we changed it, you know, when it hovered over particular types of objects, like we define those within the options pile. So yeah, there's a lot you can do here. Let's see. Any other questions? I mean, I think the only things that we haven't talked about at all are, we didn't really mention loops and viewports. I think, you know, of the things we haven't talked about, screen position is quite important. As I mentioned, it's basically just done with that @ statement and left or right. But let's just use that as an excuse to, as maybe the last thing that we do here, take a quick look at the tutorial. So this would be a really good place to go next when you kind of venture off on your own. So if we launch this, the script for it is not always the most readable, so, but the actual visual novel itself really steps you through some things a lot. In a really nice way. So, and you can kind of pick and choose, you know, there's equivalents to a lot of the like online documentation here in this thing. It's all done with Ren'Py. So, you know, also anything that you see in this, you know, is something that can be done with Ren'Py. So you can have things like scrolling menus with choices. So let's see, there's section for screen positions. And they kind of mention that you can have decimals or full numbers like we were talking about, and that it treats them differently. So it automatically assumes that a decimal is like a fraction of the total screen size, and a whole number is like an actual pixel value of how many pixels over to go. So here they have, like, they're telling you the position and also showing a little animated cursor. So upper left, X position of 0.5, it's halfway over, X position 1.0. Right? Or you can do it based on like 400, 800, things like that. Y is exactly the same. So yeah, does anyone have a guess as far as what the screen position would correspond to? Middle one, do you say?
Yeah.
Excellent. So the other thing to kind of keep in mind when you're positioning images is each image has like a reference point. So an image can be quite a large thing, but there's always, when you're positioning it, you're positioning the reference point. And you can actually move that around, and sometimes that can be quite handy. So they kind of go into some more details about that. We won't dwell on it too much. But sometimes it can be helpful to shift around this little anchor point on the image. So like if you want to position it, and you've got your anchor point set up here, it's, you know, basically think of it that way. Like it's going to bring the image point to the location. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you often want to put the anchor point in the middle so it spins around the center rather than like around some other point in space. I think the most common use for this, at least that I've found, is you can set X position and Y position, but you can also use something called align. And if you do align, it will change both the anchor and the position at the same time. So if you align 0, like with 0, then it's actually like making the left side flush. It's kind of like left aligning text, because it's going to move the reference point to the far left of the image, and it's going to position the image to the far left of the screen. Then if you did X align 1.0, it moves the anchor point to the far right of the image and moves the image to the far right of the screen. So it's like flush with the right side. So that can be really handy when you just want to make sure you're not like accidentally cutting off some images.
Oh, because otherwise you wouldn't know how far over.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So then even if like you just go in, change the image size to make it wider, it's still going to stay on screen, which can be super handy. Like, especially if you're working with like a separate artist, you know, the less that their changes will cause you to have to change the script, the better generally. So yeah, this is just them reinforcing that. X line of 0, X line of 1, X line of 0.5 center. Right. So yeah, and there's lots of other stuff in here that covers all kinds of different topics. So many cool things you can do. I wonder, not sure if I remember the one, I guess it's mini games where they show you Pong. I give you a long. There we go. All right. Let's see if I remember the controls here. So yeah, I guess it's like move the mouse and then your paddle follows it. Click to serve. Oh, terrible. I was destroyed by Eileen. No thanks. So yeah, that's Ren'Py. I love it. I definitely recommend it for all kinds of things, not just visual novels, but it's especially great for story-driven games. Definitely check out the tutorial and the online documentation. Let's see. There's a really supportive community for Ren'Py and a lot of people who are willing to help. If you go to ren'py.org and go to the forums, then you'll find lots of cool stuff there. If I can remember how to get to the forums. You can also find lots of example games if you want to see other stuff that's been created in Ren'Py. There's people uploading stuff here all the time, sort by category and stuff like that. So that's that. Any other questions? I think, oh, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, sort of like a couple of interview questions. It would be very hard to get this from, you wouldn't get this from a manual. So that's the reason for being here. So,
Yeah.
from your perspective as a gamer, is that the word, or game writer?
Sure.
Game maker.
I'll take any of those.
I just have to use my hands to get my question across. To take a straight novel, it's just written. If the mindset that's in the mind of the author is this, we call it maybe linear.
Okay.
And that the reader is going to see that there's things going here, but it's going to wind up here. It's one stream like control.
Right.
When you're writing this, designing or writing, do you picture it as like that, or something else that goes like this, and like this, depending on what the reader or the audience is choosing? How complex is your mindset, I guess, as a game writer, about what you actually create?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's something that you almost, if you're more used to just writing in like a linear fashion for a story, there is some amount of sort of new skills involved, right? Or maybe to some degree sort of retraining your brain a little bit to think about it that way. The way I personally visualize it is just kind of like a tree structure where different choices, branch out to like a different section of the story, and each section is like a little, like the equivalent of a label. It's like a little box with all the pages for that part of the story in it. Kind of like, in some ways I visualize it as just choose your own adventure because I grew up reading them, and so that process of branching, I just kind of visualize that as like two separate lines going to another part of the story, effectively. So I think that maybe one thing that can be helpful with that is check out Twine, because as I mentioned, Twine has like a visual tool for actually accomplishing some of the same stuff as Ren'Py. So rather than just typing everything out in a script file, which I think to me, like that brings my mind a little bit back into like linear mode, right?
Yeah.
Where like I'm just going line by line, right? Although, when you jump, that's the branch, but you just got everything laid out in this big flat file. But if you look in Twine, you actually set them up as like boxes where like this box has like these paragraphs of text that show when you get there, and then it presents these choices. And if the player clicks on this choice, you actually basically like drag an arrow to another box that has another part of the story. So just in terms of trying to visualize it, I think that would be a really good exercise, whether or not you're going to ultimately use Twine.
Then that's great you said that. So when you are writing in Ren'Py, is your mindset, in your case, your specific case, is it more like what Twine actually shows you? It's just that you have to deal with this text, but in your mind, you actually have all of these connections.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, at this point, I started reading Choose Your Own Adventure games when I was quite young, and also playing games that had some element of interactive story. And then I became a programmer, starting around high school. So you start to kind of, I think, get more accustomed to thinking of things in that way as like a system with like branches and like weird
Yeah.
interacting parts and maybe parts that are operating in parallel in some ways and all these other nonlinear, like ways of visualizing nonlinear things. Because often as a programmer, you're dealing with these weird complex systems that have all these moving parts, right? So, I guess that makes me like, unfortunately, less well equipped to, it's hard for me to go back and then remember like what were the things that were most helpful to me in that transition process, because there's been a lot of steps since then. But I feel like I'm getting away from like your specific question. So
I think I'm getting up, I don't want to dominate, but I'll just finish it with this. Because I used to do a lot of programming, so when we program something, yeah, I can see that it's similar to interactive novel in that you know very well that you have no idea of specific use. You know it's going to be used, let's say, for some accounting in some office. You don't know what's going to come in, and the bugs are always because you got into some place that you didn't expect those combinations.
right.
So when you're writing a program, you know, you'll have this idea of all of these things. Maybe they're not simultaneous in most average programs, literally processing simultaneously, but at least there's all these branches, and you don't know ever, you don't attempt to know ever where everybody's ever going to be. There's infinite number of stories, right? When you run run something. So is this a similar mindset that you have there when you're writing an interactive novel?
I think to a degree, yes. Although I think there's a whole continuum of like to what level of complexity you want to go as far as your branching. So, for example, if you go kind of this route that the question example goes, where you're just using menu choices and jumping to different labels, maybe you don't even use variables necessarily. At that point, like the player is still like quite constrained, right? I mean, you've kind of set up this architecture. They can wander their different path through it, but there's really only so many paths because there's only so many choices. You know, there could be some combinatorial element, and you could circle back to like a previous path. There can be complications, but a lot of times, you know, at least when people are initially making visual novels, at least I suppose I would suggest like keep your sort of branching architecture simple, like do one that's kind of a gentler for you and for the player. Where things then start to get a little more complicated, and as far as like that continuum goes, is once you introduce variables and really keeping track of like a lot more of kind of the state of the world or these characters. You know, if they do have like role-playing game style stats and stuff, then, you know, I'd expect you to end up doing more debugging in general, in the more traditional programming sense, in those sorts of situations, just because then you can get into cases where like, oh, only when this variable is this specific value and this one other variable is this other, you know, then there's this weird conflicting edge case, right? But when you're just walking through sort of a predefined set of branches, there aren't as many edge cases generally, like unexpected things that happen. So yeah, that's